Hello, my traumatized babies and mentally ill Barbies. We are going to talk about Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grib Scribe by Thomas Ligotti. And this, my babies and Barbies, is how horror is done right. At least for me.
I am not dying in a nightmare. An overview.
Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grim Scribe are collections of supernatural horror. And the horror of most of these short stories springs from the notion that human consciousness is an aberration, a malignant mutation that, once developed, doomed humankind to be forever tormented by an existential specter, a knowledge that we are all fake, hollow things, animated by an alien force whose only intention is to annihilate itself, and will puppet us to that end, or at least into terrible transformations that render us utterly non-human. Ligotti does believe this, at least the part about consciousness being a horrendous mistake of evolution, and he outlines this philosophy in his nonfiction book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which I did not like. There are many terrible things about humanity and consciousness. However, this sort of perspective excludes the wonderful things about being alive. I know that's a bit hard to see right now, but when we can't see, our scope becomes myopic. We're not seeing totality, so I can't get behind it as an actual philosophy of life. But as a philosophy of horror, it's amazing, and it produces great art.
The great chemists are always dreaming new things, the qualities of the art.
The writing is really great all around. The only things I'd mention is that the style and the voice is overtly intellectual, formal, and slightly antiquated, which is used to comedic effect often in Songs of a Dead Dreamer. It's also a bit dense, so if you don't like any of that, you're looking for more of a page-turner with a fast pace, you will not like this. I could see how this prose would alienate people. But for me, that is part of the enjoyment. These are the sorts of stories, at least in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, that you want to linger over and soak up the atmosphere, the imagery. These stories, again, mostly in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, are fantastic at evoking a sense of the uncanny. And that's why I read horror. I love that sense of unreality, that things are not as they are, and every so often, that other thing peeks in at us. It helps that I actually believe that, and I enjoy seeing it reflected back at me effectively. The Dreamer stories are very preoccupied with mannequins, dolls, puppets, and clowns, and to a lesser extent, illusionist magic, mesmerism, and hypnosis. In Grim Scribe, the clowns are around a little, and the facsimiles, but movies and film take over more, as well as art. The occult, otherworlds, and dreams are pervasive in both collections. These stories aren't graphically violent, with a couple of exceptions. In Notes on the Writing of Horror, a Story, The Lost Art of Twilight, and Masquerade of a Dead Sword, a Tragedy. But even what occurs in these stories isn't upsettingly gory. What's great about Ligotti is that he tends to suggest on the page, then let your brain do the work. So terrible things are happening, he's just not waxing poetic over it. And for me, the effect is more fucked up, so I prefer it. There is some fat phobia and misogyny in the collections. The misogyny is more virulent and more prevalent, especially in the first collection. But the integrity of the stories tends to outweigh that turbulence. But if you flat out don't want to deal with it, this will be a skip.
The extraordinary is a province of the solitary soul, the finest jewels.
My favorite stories are The Frolic, Les Fleurs, The Chemist, which is one of the Nyctalops trilogy, Dr. Locrian's Asylum, Bastarian, and the greatest tale, in my opinion, Mr. Volk and Mr. Veitch. Volk and Veitch, to me, is the best fictional synthesis of what Ligotti's attempting to impart in Songs of a Dead Dreamer. And I'm going to read to you my favorite passage in the story and of both collections. Veitch is in Volk's apartment and has encountered a puppet called the Ticket Man that becomes animated while he watches it and laughs at him. "Did you ever wonder, Mr. Veitch," Volk begins, parading slowly toward his guest while holding one side of his coat like the train of a gown, I say, did you ever wonder what it is that makes the animation of a wooden dummy so terrible to see, not to mention hear? Listen to it. I mean, really listen. Ya ha 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 ha. A series of sounds that becomes excruciatingly eloquent when uttered by the ticket man. They are a species of poetry that sings what should not be sung, that speaks what should not be spoken. But what in the world is it laughing about? Nothing, it would seem. No clear motives or impulses make the dummy laugh, and yet it does. But what is this laughter for, you might well ponder? It seems to be for your ears alone, doesn't it? It seems to be directed at every part of your being. It seems knowing. And it is knowing, but in another way from what you suppose, in another direction entirely. It is not you the dummy knows. It is only itself. The question is not, what is the laughter for? Not at all. The question is, where does it come from? This, in fact, is what inspires your apprehension. While the dummy does terrorize you, his terror is actually greater than yours. Think of it. Wood waking up. I can't put it any clearer than that. And let's not forget about the painted hair and lips, the glassy eyes. These too are aroused from a sleep that should never have been broken. These too are now part of a tingling network of dummy nerves, alive and aware in a way we cannot begin to imagine. This is something too painful for tears, and so the dummy laughs in your face, trying to give vent to a horror that was no part of his old home of wood and paint and glass. But this horror is the very essence of its new home, our world, Mr. Beach. This is what is so terrible about the laughing ticket man. Go to sleep now, dummy. There. He's gone back to his lifeless slumber. Be glad I didn't make one that screams, Mr. Beach. And be gladder still that the dummy, after all, is just a device. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Veach? Yes, says Veach, who seems not to have heard a word of Vok's monologue. And that, in a nutshell, is what makes so many of the stories in Songs of a Dead Dreamer so fantastic. Unfortunately,
There are those who require witnesses to their doom, the tragedy of Grimscribe.
in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, Ligotti consistently pulls off feat after feat of prestidigitation. Many of these stories accomplish the magic he writes about. They are alive. They are the false creations that terrorize us with their awareness that should not be, in very defiance of the natural order. They are fiction that is real. And when it comes to literature, that is the ultimate achievement for me. But if Songs of a Dead Dreamer are the creations of the mad genius maestro, the stories in Grimscribe are the empty imitations. The trick is not repeated. While the stories in Grimscribe are nowhere near bad, except for the glamour, they are not the same. They are the Jessica as opposed to Brittany. They are inert and way too derivative of Lovecraft to do much but morbidly amuse. They're weighed down by a morose attitude, and the humor and sadism that made Songs of a Dead Dreamer so fun is just gone. Unfortunately, an idea possessed Ligotti in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and so he was able to create transcendent art. But by Grimscribe, he was in possession of the idea, and so the magic fled. It is always dangerous to create real art. Grimscribe is the consequence. It really can't be any other way.
I am not dying in a nightmare. Final thoughts.
If you are a lover of uncanny horror, you should absolutely read Ligotti if you haven't already. Even his mediocre is better than most of us will ever be. And even at his worst, you will not be wasting your time. These are stories I will return to again and again. I've not read uncanny horror like this in a while, and I likely won't for a while. And that makes me incredibly sad. If you've read Ligotti, tell me if you love or hate him, and what your favorite or most despised story is. Now, excuse me, while I go weep over the fact that I will never create anything half as fantastic.